Welcome to another film club live stream for Palestine Bookshelf. This is our second. This is part of what we're trying on the new channel. We have not been discussing films as much, obviously, because there's a lot of focus on books. But films are a great complement to books because they give us this visual representation of what we're seeing, and there's more immediacy. We're talking about things that have happened recently. And so that's part of why I picked this documentary to discuss. Yes, it is 6 months old. So if you've had a chance to watch it, which I'm hoping you did, because this is going to be more participatory today. Hopefully, you've seen the film and you have some thoughts and ideas or questions that you wanted to ask about, or you have points that you'd like to make. That's what the chat's open for. I'm going to start with my key takeaways from this film. Firstly, uh, things that I already knew but were confirmed, that I knew from just bits and pieces of news stories and bits and pieces of hearing people that I really respect talk. The first is that Israel knew that this attack was going to happen. They may not have known it was going to happen on that day, but they had video footage, they have satellite footage of Hamas practicing assaults, cutting fences, flying hang gliders around. So the idea that they didn't know is a lie. So they definitely knew. Same thing, America knew that an attack of planes hitting towers was going to happen. All of the people who went up and lied, and Condoleezza Rice, President Bush, all the people said, "Oh, we never saw that this was happening." There are texts relating. There were exercises run in which planes ran into buildings. In fact, if you listen to the audio, one of the operators on September 11th asks, "Is this real world or exercise?" Because they had been doing exercises like this, that planes were hijacked and run into buildings. So this idea that, oh, we didn't know, is a lie. Definitely Israel knew. They may not have known it was going to happen on October the 7th. Fine. But the thing is, if there is evidence that Israel knew and let it happen, that would be the end of Netanyahu. And I think that evidence is either being suppressed or is part of why he's prosecuting this forward, that he has the idea, and you've heard this phrase in the media, de-escalation through escalation. So in order to get to a peace point is to ratchet it up and keep going. And so he's in a crisis, so he thinks he's just going to keep going headlong forward into this. So secondly, no evidence of mass rapes. So I thought that it was wonderful that they had a woman who is quite involved with these sorts of situations, and she said everywhere where you're going to have conflict, there is a possibility, a likelihood, a high likelihood that some rape was committed. And this is across the board. This isn't trying to single out Hamas or the Israelis or anyone else. That there is likely that some rape was committed somewhere. But the idea of being mass coordinated rapes, firstly, that's been disproven. But secondly, there's not even any forensic evidence of any rapes. So that's the problem is, while she made a very reasonable statement, and she wasn't speaking on behalf of the Israeli government, but she's just saying, yeah, it's probably likely that some rapes happened, but there's no evidence. And the Israelis are, if they were so keen to make the case that there were, then where is the evidence? Why didn't you bring it all out? You don't have to name the person who did it. Just list out, this is what happened. There's no evidence of that. There's no evidence of beheaded babies. Many of us knew this intrinsically. We knew this on October 8th, 9th, 10th, when they told us that babies were beheaded. We knew that this wasn't true. Instinctively, we didn't have any evidence. We didn't know why, but we just knew. I mean, partly we knew because the IDF was saying it. So 99%, 99.9% of whatever the IDF says is a lie. So we knew, okay, probably it's a lie. But secondly, why? Why would you behead babies? It doesn't even make any sense. No evidence of babies in ovens. No evidence of babies being cut out of a pregnant woman's body. And all of these lies were perpetrated by one person in particular, Yossi Landau, who the documentary talks about is someone who was accused of child molestation, which, if you don't know, Israel is a place where sexual assault offenders go to hide. If they're accused of sexual assault in another country, they come to Israel and hide from their charges. And so there are a lot of molesters living in Israel. Apart from all the other charges that they're involved in, it's not that surprising that it's a country that loves and supports rape, right? That they also have a bunch of child molesters living there. But Yossi Landau was involved in all this. Then he's the person who goes out and says, "Oh yes, I saw this baby," oh, fake crying in front of the cameras. And then when he's asked to produce a picture, the journalist apologized and said, I'm sorry, I don't see a baby there." And it was like a part of a charred leg. But where is the cutout baby? And part of the burning of the bodies, how did those bodies get burned? There's no idea that Hamas burned those bodies. They were burned because of shells that were shot by Israeli tanks into the kibbutzim, killing their own people. And I think that is one of the most important takeaways, which cannot be repeated enough, is that 1,200 number, first of all, it's not even accurate. There were 1,400 people killed, 200 of which were Hamas fighters. Of the 1,200, on the low end, a couple hundred were killed by the Israelis. On the high end, maybe as many as 400 were killed by the Israelis. So if we want to have a true reckoning, we'd say, oh, it was about 1,000 that might have been killed by Hamas. But there still needs to be evidence of that. I don't know that we can really say that there were 1,000, especially when we see the Hamas fighters were very surprised to get as far as they did. And you could see some of them were unprofessional, untrained. They didn't know what they were doing. They acted savagely and poorly in some situations, just randomly killing civilians. That's not good. That's not approved of. That's wrong. That should be condemned. But the reality is that they were quite surprised to get where they were. And the idea was grab people and go back to Gaza. I also didn't know, found out from this documentary, that a bunch of people from Gaza came in and did some looting. Also, again, not morally right, but I understand the frustration. I understand why people who've been so oppressed would react in this way. I'm not praising those actions, and I'm not saying they're the most wonderful thing, but they're hardly international war crimes that you came and got a plasma TV in a settlement and you went back. Like against what Israel has done, that is not even a counting error. The question is what happened to those hostages, and we have video evidence as well as anonymous testimony. Anonymous meaning we have the back of the head of the pilot talking to an Israeli journalist, so we don't see their face. But he's saying, yeah, we just shot at people going across the border. They weren't able to tell. People weren't wearing green shirts for Palestine and white and blue shirts for Israel. People who were being potentially taken as hostages were taken to the Gaza border, and Apache helicopters shot Hellfire missiles and blew up and killed a bunch of Israelis. Do you think the Israelis are going to tell you this? Do you think the Israelis are going to talk about the Hannibal Doctrine and how for them it's better to have a dead Israeli than a captured Israeli? Because if you knew that, then you would realize they don't care about the hostages. They would rather kill all the hostages now so that Hamas has no leverage. That would be the best case scenario for the Israelis. And they've demonstrated that by what they did. If they really cared about Israeli lives, they wouldn't have randomly shot at people crossing a border who they couldn't have known were civilians or combatants. They couldn't have known were Palestinians or Israelis. It's an immoral army. And the irony is it claims to be the most moral army in the world. And we know they are the least moral army in the world. So the reality is Israel killed a number of people. We don't really have an idea of how those people were killed because a lot of people were killed in kibbutzim by Israeli tank shells. Hamas does not possess tanks. Hamas doesn't have tank shells. They cannot collapse houses with the type of arms that they have. They have light arms and maybe they have some rocket launchers. But for those of you who are unfamiliar with the military, rocket launchers cannot collapse houses. All they can do is maybe punch a hole in the wall or blow out a window. I think some of you have heard me say I visited a settler's home in Stroh, which is out just a little bit outside the Gaza border, and I saw a rocket impact on their house, and it had taken out the area below a window. They had gone to a safe room. There's an app in Israel about these rockets, but this is the problem: is people referring to the rockets Hamas uses as rockets, and that's the same word that they use for what we saw when Iran sent its just punishment to Israeli military bases, I guess a week ago now, or more than a week ago now. And we saw they use the same word, but clearly it's not the same thing. One is handmade by people under occupation. They're not directed. They just sort of randomly fly out. Sometimes they land in Palestine. Sometimes they land in Gaza, in the occupied territories. So I was at the Erez crossing and I saw where one had landed right there and blown out the windows of a Palestinian taxi. And so it's a random type of rocketry that's used out of Gaza. And this is the excuse. They said, well, they shoot rockets at us. Say, well, it's not really a threat to you. It's effectively like throwing a stone. You're trying to express resistance, and you have an early warning system. You have this Iron Dome that can deal with these very amateur homemade missiles. So it's not really a threat. What it is an excuse for Israel to come, and these are their words, not mine, mow the lawn. This is the phrase that their official government people use to talk about humans. They say they go in there and they're going to mow the lawn, they're going to kill people, and that's what's going on. Uh, the other thing is, it seems Hamas did not know about the music festival, but it's not clear that the Israelis knew either. It was just one of these things, and a very unfortunate thing, because Hamas had a plan to attack military bases, which they did. Military, IDF military. I shed no tears for any IDF soldiers that were killed. They are legitimate targets of an occupational force. They knew what they signed up for. They signed up to oppress the Palestinians, and that means sometimes when you deal with oppressed peoples, you might get killed. So no, I have no tears shed for that. The settlers, I also have no tears shed for the settlers, because if you choose to be an Israeli settler, you are outside of the norm of Israeli society. You are not choosing to live in an established place, but you are moving to places that encroach on the land of the occupied territories, and you're using that as an advanced base to one day take it over. So settlers are going to be portrayed as some sort of innocent civilians. They're not. They're the most extreme people. They go out and harass, destroy Palestinian crops, take chainsaws to olive trees. They play loud music. They often wear their reservist uniform, so it blurs the line for Palestinians. Am I dealing with an IDF soldier? Am I dealing with a settler? So I shed no tears for settlers either, because they blur the line between being civilians and being associated with the military, and with the colonial illegal theft of the occupied territories, which, again, we can have a different conversation about all of Palestine, but at least internationally recognized borders of the state of Palestine. So this documentary is only an hour long. So for me, there's no excuse for people not to have seen it. And I'm talking about both sides, from people who support Palestine and people who would say that they support the criminal entity. That it's important to go look and then say, is it true or is it not? And all of these are true. So again, I'm going to go through it one more time, and if there's any questions, we'll address those in the chat, and if not, then we'll wrap up the stream for today. The first is that Israel knew that this was going to happen. They just may not have known exactly when, but if there is evidence that they knew when, and that Netanyahu let it happen so that he would have an excuse, that would be the end for him forever in Israel. There is no evidence of mass rapes. There is no evidence of beheaded babies. There is no evidence of babies being put in ovens. There is no evidence of babies being cut out of women's bodies. There is evidence and eyewitness testimony and testimony from IDF soldiers, IDF pilots, that they randomly shot. And when I say randomly, they did not know who they were shooting at, because you could not identify it in that time, in that way. And they shot at people trying to cross in the Gaza border. Those are facts. Yes, was there some lack of discipline from Hamas randomly shooting unarmed civilians? 100%. However, as I said, settlers are not everyday civilians in Israel, and that's my own fault for not having done. There's a couple books that I have targeted to talk about the settlements, and that settlement project. I haven't talked about that enough on the channel, and that's my fault, and I will do that more. But if you've taken the time to read this, as I've learned more and more, settlers are on the fringes of Israeli society. In fact, I would argue settlers are holding Israel hostage from any possibility of doing anything moral or just. That's a conversation for a different day. Yossi Landau is identified as the originator of a lot of these lies. He did not respond to requests for comment, and I'm sure he's probably gone into hiding, or he's been made a hero, because that's what Israel does. Is they hide child molesters from extradition, and they praise rapists and try to break them out of military prison. Okay, let's look at the chat. Avi, I knew it was BS the moment I heard it. I didn't know the moment I heard it. It sounded weird, but I was dubious for sure. Uh, Remember when Sleepy Joe lied to the world claiming he saw such photos? White House had, yeah, the White House had to walk it back right away, but you don't hear it. This is the whole problem is something gets announced, you hear that it gets taken back a few days later, but it's too late. The word's out. And there's a phrase for this, and I don't know whether it was Mark Twain. I'm sure that there are other equivalents in other languages and cultures, but in the American idiom, we say that a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to put its trousers on. And so if Biden says, I saw the photos, that's what everybody remembers. But 2 days later, when the White House says, oh, that was wrong, he people don't know that. They just remember, and it's still being repeated. Kamala, all these other clowns are all repeating the same thing. Trump, etc., beheaded babies, all this other stuff. It's a year later. There's been investigations. There's no evidence, and people still repeat the lies. This is who we're dealing with. And so, people who think if you're going to vote for the blue team or you're going to vote for the red team, they're going to save you. They're all lying liars who don't look at the evidence. So, I don't know why people are excited about one candidate or another. Politics are not going to save us. The idea is people have to change hearts and minds, and you do that through education. And in that way, people will be forced to do something. But the idea I'm going to pick this one leader and he's going to save us or she's going to save us is, I think, crazy to me. 100% of Palestine is occupied. Avi, I, your point is well taken. I think that it's hard to make that. Um, I think I'm always in beginner mode. I'm always thinking, how do I talk to somebody about this who who is unfamiliar? And so I always start with 67 discussions. But because I think I've been over time converted to one democratic state as a solution, I don't I'm not necessarily bothered about whether it's going to be this or that. I think that this solution will hopefully encompass all of Palestine. But for purposes of what I was talking about with the settlements and how they're projected, if you look at a map of the settlements and you see where they're placed, it's all encroaching in the occupied territory specifically. There's not as many settlements in the middle of nowhere in places where there are no Palestinians. Jaffa Cake. The settlers in the West Bank are backed by the army and government. Yeah, well, the settlers everywhere are backed by the army and government, and we heard about this in near Avishai Cohen's text, "Love Israel, Support Palestine." I was very I was very amused. Maybe amused is the wrong word. So obviously, with all the work I've been doing this last year on this issue, people might have found it strange that I reviewed a book and gave a positive review to a book called "Love Israel, Support Palestine." And one of the comments was, I no, I don't love Israel. And I said to the commenter, I said, you don't need to love Israel to read this book because this book has receipts that help the Palestinian cause. And this man is sharing his own perspective. You don't have to agree with it, you don't have to love it. But I do love all the receipts that he gives us. What he did, I don't know of any other testimony in a book format in which crimes against Palestinians are detailed by a serving officer in the IDF. He still serves in the IDF to this day. He's a bit of an idealist. Um, but read the book. Don't just say, well, because it says love Israel and I hate Israel, I can't read the book. This will stunt your ability to learn things if you react emotionally. And trust me, I get it. It's an emotional issue. It's hard to sometimes be balanced and be objective. But if you're going to be serious about this, if you want to go into intellectual or verbal battle with Zionists, you need to know what they know and more. Their big weakness is they don't know that you know. So I always laugh because Zionists and other supporters are going to quote Benny Morris to me, but the way they quote him leads me to believe that they've read a Wikipedia entry or a news article. But nobody who has read Benny Morris would consider him, as a historian, a supporter of Zionism. We know that Benny Morris is a Zionist because of his words and actions outside of his books. But his books mostly share a historical record which is in favor of the Palestinians. And then at the end of the books, he shares his own personal conclusions, which fine, he's welcome to them, even though they're crazy and they're weird and they're totally at odds with the facts that he just presented us for 500 pages. Fine. But Benny Morris for me is me saying back to the Zionists, I know you haven't read this because you don't like books, but if you did, you'd know that a Zionist wrote this book. And I've read 2,000 pages of his writing now, And no one is going to tell me that Benny Morris says that 6 Arab armies invaded us and um, they were told to leave. He refutes all of the regular Zionist talking points in his work. And I think maybe he was just a young man and idealistic and he wanted to find out the answers to these questions. And he answered them before his ideology and adulthood caught up with him. And then he decided, no, I'm going to make my bed with the Israelis. These are my people anyway. And then you hear stuff like the ethnic cleansing didn't go far enough. Um, so so I hope, Avi, that answers your question. Yes, 100% of Palestine is occupied. I agree, but that may be too radical for a talking point with someone. I just try to refer to the occupied territories for now. That doesn't rule out talking about other stuff. Okay, I'll wait one more minute to see if there are any other questions. Again, I'm experimenting with this film club uh, format. It's not clear to me that it will work in the same way that I had thought it would be. And that's okay if it doesn't. I can adjust it and pivot as necessary. But we may do it every week. We may do it once a month. It'll just depend. I'm going to watch the numbers and see how many people watched it live. And then I'll look and see how many people watched it afterwards. That was something that was very surprising to me. The film club that we did last week, the um, the views of it after it premiered was actually much higher than I would have expected. I thought it would maybe not be as interesting to people, but the channel is still fairly new, even though those of you who may have followed me over from my main channel may know that this work is not new, but the channel is new. So that may be part of it. We just don't have a lot of subscribers yet. So we don't have the same ability to draw that my main channel does because of the number of subscriber difference. All right, everybody, thank you for taking the time to join, listening to me talk about this. I really encourage you, if you did not have a chance to watch this documentary, really, there's no excuse. If you want to be knowledgeable about October the 7th, take the time. These journalists work hard to put together an excellent documentary, very well put together, and you'll learn something and you'll be able to pass it on to your open-minded friends. So do you think you know what happened on October the 7th? Would you be willing to take a look at this documentary and maybe we could talk about it? And as I say, these openings are always very small because I shared this in a recent Substack article. Shameless plug for Substack. If you want to see some of my writing, if you go to Palestine Bookshelf on Substack, you'll see that I made the point that there's really only a small group of people who are actually genuinely open-minded and interested in learning. So that's who we're preparing for. We're not preparing for the Zionists who are going to, tell all their lies and try to talk about how they're the greatest victims ever. That's not who we're worried about. We're worried about the people. Worried is the wrong word. We are focused, concerned, dedicated to the people who are actually open-minded. Those are the people we can win over, and we can win them over through knowledge, calmness, politeness, civility, and being quietly passionate about it. As I say, probably right below anger, because a lot of us probably do feel anger and frustration. But anger and frustration doesn't really get you anywhere. But what you can do is sublimate that into a sort of passion and engagement, which can inspire people. And I think that can lead people to say, why is this person so engaged? Why is this person so inspired? And then they will stop and take stock just for that. They'll say, wow, okay, I don't know if this person is correct, but clearly this person is interested. And so let me hear what he or she has to say. And I think that's where we can have that slight opening and then say, hey, would you take a look at this documentary? And then as we build that bridge, as we add facts and we say, well, why don't you take this? And then say, I'm open to reading what you have to say. Do you have an article sent my way? And then usually it'll just be the normal Hasbro talking points, which you can just say, let me take this down one by one, because they're so easy. The lies are so basic, like how they've had what they've had since 1948 to come up with better lies. And they're just relying on the same old lies, since 1948. You would figure they would get more creative, and they have, right? So babies in ovens, babies beheaded. But realistically, these are just variations of old lies that we've been seeing since 48. And we shouldn't fall for them. And if we have an opportunity, a tool like this documentary to share, we should. Leo, Israelis opened their archives from 1948, which Benny Morris based his books on. The 1980s, those archives have since been closed. Yes. And in fact, Leo, they only opened a portion of the archives. So Morris and Pape talk about this in their work, that effectively only 5% of the archives were opened. So get this, all of the facts we have from Israeli authors come from only 5% of the archives, and then they had to close it afterwards, which means they only gave us the 5% that they thought they could get away with. which leads me to believe the 95% that they didn't share are even worse. So all we have in Morris's work, in Pape's work, is the least horrible stuff, which if you've read their stuff, you know it's pretty bad. So, yes, the Israelis closed the archives. Why would you do that? Because you don't want even your own citizens to know. When those books came out, it caused a major shock in Israeli society, and they still haven't come to terms with it. Ilan Pape had to be canceled out of Israel, and people always try to say, yes, he was shown to be a liar, and now he's got a job at a third-rate university in England. What does that say? It says that Israeli people can't handle the truth. That's what it says. All right, everybody, thank you for taking the time to join. As I say, if you are watching this stream later, you can support the channel by subscribing, sharing this. If you want to send a super thanks, I don't think you can send a super thanks yet. We're not up there. So subscribe to the channel so we can get to a level in which we can take super thanks. Otherwise, you can still go to Palestine Bookshelf. There's different ways you can support us. There's links on the website. And that's still getting built out. Please be patient. Soon the shelf will appear with all of the books that I've read so far. And I think we'll add these films as well. Leo, good point. I didn't know that. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining. And I will see you on the next film club.